Good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world. I believe we have a good audience this evening with participants from the United States, China, Australia, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, and perhaps elsewhere. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to be hosting this webinar tonight on a new book titled Rivers of Iron: Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia. For much of the past decade, we've heard and read a lot about China's Belton Road Initiative, which involves hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure development in the effort to make Southeast Asia better connected and economically integrated. This book, co-authored by Professors David M. Lampton, Selina Ho, and Kuik Cheng-Chwee, covers an important part of the BRI, the development of railroads, particularly high-speed railways. A tremendous amount of material about this topic is written in this book, from the long gestating idea of rail connectivity between China and Southeast Asia, Beijing's experience in developing high-speed rail technology, the domestic politics involved in exporting high-speed rail to Southeast Asia, how these projects in places like Thailand, Laos, Malaysia, and Indonesia have been negotiated, implemented, and at times stalled, as well as the geoeconomic and geopolitical factors that shape the evolving patterns of Southeast Asia, China engagement on rail connectivity. Finally, what are the implications of all of this for China, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world? Let me take a moment to introduce each speaker. David M. Lampton is Professor Emeritus of Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, where for many years he was the director of the China Studies program. He retired from SAIS in 2018. For the past year, Professor Lampton was a research scholar and Oxenberg-Rollin Fellow at Stanford University's Asia Pacific Research Center. He recently rejoined SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute as a Senior Research Fellow. From 2006 to 2018, Professor Lampton was a member of the Asia Foundation's Board of Trustees. And from 2014 to 2018, he was the chairman of the board, and when he stepped down, he was named as chairman emeritus. He's written many books on China. His most recent, before Rivers of Iron, is Following the Leader: Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. Selina Ho is an assistant professor and chair of the MA program in International Affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. She is the author of Thirsty Cities, Social Contracts, and Public Good Provision in China and India. She has a PhD from SAIS. And our third speaker will be Kuik Cheng-Chwee. He's an associate professor and head of the Center for Asian Studies, Institute of Malaysian and International Studies at the National University of Malaysia. Dr. Kuik is also a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute, and he too has a PhD from SAIS, so you can all see the connection there quite clearly. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes. This will be followed by questions and comments for about 25 minutes. If you wish to raise a question, please go to the Q&A box on your screen and write your question. I'd appreciate you identifying yourself and our institution and your institutional affiliation for our speakers. I will relay these questions to our speakers, and if you're addressing a question to a specific speaker, please indicate this. We want to make the best use of our time. So without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Professor Lampton. And so, Mike, the floor is yours, and thank you all for attending this evening.
Yes, well, thank you. On behalf of my two co-authors, I want to thank you, John, and thank Shirley Keating for arranging this. And I want to just thank the Asia Foundation, not only for the great work that it does throughout Asia, but for helping us in the process of doing the on-the-ground field research in 7 Southeast Asian countries. The Foundation's representatives in many of these countries gave us local knowledge and helped us, assured us that we were speaking to appropriate people given our research interests. So this product really owes a great deal to the Asia Foundation. I also just want to briefly thank the University of California Press and its editor, Reed Malcolm. He was a full intellectual partner throughout the conceptualization and then development of this project. And the press has always been a great asset to me and my colleagues as our careers unfolded. Also, of course, because this is such a big territory covered, it necessitated a lot of travel and field research and so forth, and funding was a major, made it possible. And I want to thank the Smith Richardson Foundation, Stanford University, and SAIS for their support. This project carried me back to an earlier era of big cross-country comparative studies. And so it required the help of a lot of people and connections to lots of different organizations within these countries, and certainly multilateral and multinational organizations beyond the region directly. I think there are a number of things that could be said, but I think the first might be to provide just a bit of context and the purpose, because if you're going to spend 5 years of your life doing a project, you have a purpose in mind. And as this project was unfolding, the idea of decoupling and diversification of supply chains and loosening up, in effect, the links of globalization. And I guess our underlying value proposition, and it's sort of the dedication of the book, is that this book is dedicated to the proposition that building connections is the future and building walls is the past. Now, of course, history is unfolding and we'll see, but this book is really a reflection of knocking down walls and building connections and assessing the difficulties in doing that. This book starts out really with a couple of frames. One is historical, and the history of railroads in Southeast Asia, of course, go back to the British and French colonialists. And they had the idea of opening China from the underbelly of China into Yunnan province, what's now Guangxi, Sichuan province. The imperial countries had penetrated China's coast, but France and Britain wanted to move up from the south. And so it's been a very extensive and long vision of connecting Southeast Asia to China. It was not a Chinese idea. And in fact, China was connected, the western part of China was connected to Hanoi long before it was connected to China's own coast. Carrying the story historically forward, of course, then you had the Japanese in World War II that wanted to build railroads that transected both China and Southeast Asia. After the war and decolonialization and so forth, these countries soon formed ASEAN and other groupings and had the vision of interconnectivity among themselves and then going to China, as earlier people had thought about doing previously. So the historic record is really one of Southeast Asia and rather distant powers developing the basic vision of a Pan-Asia railroad. And what has happened particularly since 2000 is that China has acquired the financial wherewithal, the technology, the industry, and the extensive connections in the world to, in effect, jump on the train that Southeast Asians themselves were determined to build. And so it's a sort of a collision of opportunity and vision. Vision in Southeast Asia, their capacity has grown through modernization and economic development and urbanization, merging with the capacity and desire of China to now contribute to this vision. But I guess the takeaway point is that BRI may be a vision that the Chinese have, but it had to await the convergence with capacity in Southeast Asia and the conditions there. So this isn't a Chinese idea being imposed on Southeast Asians. The second thing is that you have before you this map, and when I talk about the vision of rail connectivity, this is the broad contours of that vision. It's evolving, and I'm sure 20 or 30 years down the track, we'll look at this. Yeah, my expectation is that future map will look remarkably like this, but there will be important details and elaborations and probably some subtractions from this map. But the basic concept, as you can see up at the top, is a hub in Kunming in Yunnan province in South China. And to the north of Kunming and the east and the west is China. And then radiating southward from Kunming are really three basically north-south lines. The west line from Kunming goes through Mandalay down to Yangon, Rangoon, and then over to Bangkok. And that what is called the Western line. Then if you go back to Kunming and go up to the down sort of vertically north and south, you transect northern Laos, go to Vientiane on the Mekong, then down to Bangkok, and that's called the Central Line. And then hypothetically, some of it's been, rail line was built by the French. You run from Kunming to Hanoi, and then down to Ho Chi Minh City, Phnom Penh, Bangkok. You'll note that all three of those lines, east, central, and west, all converge at Bangkok, and then under this vision, shoot down the Malay Peninsula and terminate in Singapore. So each of these lines is longer than the Transcontinental Railroad of the United States built from 1863 to 1869. So the first thing to note is this is a huge engineering task. But I think what interested us as political scientists was the political engineering that's involved when you move, you're talking about 8 countries, China, and then 7 Southeast Asian nations. Each has different economic level, each has different distinctive political system, history of dealing with China or not dealing with China, different ethnic makeups where Chinese populations play a greater or lesser role. So each of these countries, you're trying to build an integrated system, but you've got to negotiate among largely autonomous units that aren't necessarily very good at coordinating with each other. So this book is really the story of how China is interacting with its southern neighbors to build incrementally a system that will transform the politics, strategic conditions, and certainly geoeconomics in the region. Now, most implementation studies look at projects that are already done and sort of do a post-mortem, what went right, what went wrong, what does it tell you about politics? This study is different than those. It has similar inspiration, but this is trying to look at a project as it unfolds. And there are a number of therefore, underlying questions that this book addresses. First, as I've already mentioned, where did the idea for this come? And I think we're in a frame of mind of seeing Xi Jinping as sort of the motive force and China, the Leviathan, working its will out on Southeast Asia. And in many respects, there's some reality to that image. But what strikes you, I think, in this book is the capacity of the smaller neighbors to influence and shape, and in some cases even manipulate China. A second whole set of questions that the book addresses are what are the problems in implementing this? I mean, just take the stretch on the central route from the China border down to Vientiane. 70% of the mileage, of the track mileage, is through bridges and tunnels. Huge engineering task. But you also have political tasks. how are you going to compensate the people displaced? How are you going to acquire the right of way? What are you going to pay the people who are displaced? What technology is going to be used? Whose workers are going to be used? So there's a huge, what you might call, set of implementation questions, which Selina will talk more about shortly. Certainly a whole nother area that the book takes on head on is, what does this mean for the distribution of global and regional power, and how's it going to change the geoeconomics of the entire region and perhaps beyond? And finally, as our colleague Cheng-Chwee Kuik is going to talk about, is the whole question of why do different Southeast Asian countries react differently to China's initiatives and potential involvement. So I think this is a very rich book that tries to look at, as objectively as possible, at all these varied questions. I'll just wind up by saying, in order to address these questions, we interviewed in all 8 countries, plus we found we had to interview in Indonesia as well, because an earlier project and ongoing project shaped the negotiations in Southeast Asia. So we interviewed in 158 different organizations, multilateral organizations, government agencies, academic think tanks, so forth. And I guess I would just conclude by saying that I think if we hadn't started this project 5 years ago, given that China is tightening up, you might say closing to some extent, at least more difficult to do the kind of interview research that we did, I think we'd have to have a little bit of a different strategy if we were starting now than 5 years ago. And maybe one of the characteristics of research going forward is going to be, we're all going to have to study China, not entirely outside China, but the balance between studying China from within and from without, I think, is going to tilt a little more in the direction of how do we understand China by the way in which it deals with other countries, societies, and organizations. So with that background, Selina, you want to jump in?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John and Shirley as well for organizing this, and Asia Foundation. As Mike mentioned, all the help that we got in our fieldwork when we went to places like Thailand and then in Laos. This is a picture of us in Laos at a construction site. Now, I think one of the things that is really different in our book from other books, perhaps on the BRI, is that we try to do something very differently, which is that we have a view from China. We also have the view from Southeast Asia in this book. And in fact, 3 of the key chapters in the book is actually focused on Southeast Asian responses and reactions and the kind of issues that are happening within Southeast Asia as China move into these countries. So there are 3 chapters just devoted to that. I think we have a very good balance on that. I mean, if we will think about it, IR theory essentially gives smaller states no agency, but and the spotlight is completely on the great powers. So in this book, we try to do something very different. We look at the interactions between China, the largest power Asia, and the great power Asia, and the relatively smaller states of Southeast Asian countries. So as we do our field work, obviously, we found that smaller states and secondary states have really a lot of agency. And in this area, we hope to contribute to a greater understanding of small state behavior. Now, let me first talk about the negotiation process between China and the Southeast Asian countries, and to show, where smaller states actually have bargaining power. And there are 3 conditions which we identify in the book, which tells us that that determines the bargaining power of smaller states. Now, the first one is size, wealth, and location do matter. So for countries like Indonesia and Thailand, they are middle powers. Essentially, they have greater leverage than Laos and are able to bargain better terms for themselves. Let's take the example of Indonesia. Indonesia was able to get the Chinese to agree to no sovereign guarantees for the project, meaning that if the project were to fail, the Indonesian government is not responsible for the risk and the loans. And as well as Indonesia was also able to get the Chinese to agree to a lower interest rate. Malaysia and Singapore are also better developed and middle income countries, and this helped in the bargaining process. Now, Thailand actually has a tremendous advantage when it comes to geography. So as you can see from the map, the map up here, all the lines to the east to the west all have to go through Bangkok. So this gives Thailand a major advantage when they negotiate with China. In fact, in one of our interviews, a very important government advisor to the government described Thailand, and I quote, as a beautiful woman who can wait to choose the best suitor. The best suitor referring to the great powers that come wooing at her doorsteps. Now for Laos, geography is definitely not an asset. It can be bypassed by, to the east, to the west, okay, by Vietnam and by Myanmar. In fact, when we do our interviews, there were a lot of anxiety within Laos that they will be bypassed. And one of the interviewees say that when they negotiate and speak to the Chinese, they actually pleaded with the Chinese not to forget them. Now, second condition for determining the bargaining power of smaller states is state capacity. Obviously, when secondary states have the ability to have greater capacity, such as robust government institutions, civil society, rule of law, the ability to monitor, to regulate human resources, all of these will give them more options. So Singapore has state capacity, for instance, and is not overly dependent on China for its economy. However, countries like Laos are heavily reliant on the Chinese economy and technical expertise. For instance, when the Chinese wanted to build the China-Laos Railway, a feasibility study has to be done. But because Laos does not have the capacity to do a feasibility study, that job was given to the Chinese side. Now that compromises the credibility and the independence of the report. The third condition that determines the bargaining power of smaller states is that of domestic politics and public opinion. Cheng-Chwee will actually spend a bit of time thinking about this, but let me just talk a little bit about this as it pertains to bargaining. So if we recall Robert Putnam's two-level theory, right? Putnam talked about bargaining as a two-level game. So at the first level, you have international bargaining. At the second level is bargaining among domestic agencies. And here public opinion plays a role as well. So leaders like Najib, who is the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, and Indonesian President Jokowi have been attacked for selling their countries to China. There are also concerns over whether locals are actually benefiting from these projects in terms of technological transfer, job creation, and one of the key issues is that Chinese companies often bring in materials from China, which leads to the sidelining of local SMEs. Now, there's therefore this very big question of whether local economies are actually benefiting. Now, so negative public opinion and unhappiness over Chinese presence also exert significant pressure on leaders as well. So if we were to come back to the two-level theory, at level 2, which is the domestic level of bargaining, the win sets for Southeast Asian countries, the politicians there are actually quite small. So this ironically strengthens bargaining at the level 1, which is the negotiations with China. This means that when they go to China and they talk to China, they can tell China, look, I'm putting my domestic position at stake here, at risk here. You have to give me more concessions. So those are the conditions when smaller states have more bargaining power when it comes to the HSR. Now, let me now turn to the challenges of implementation. So as Chinese companies venture into Southeast Asian countries, they encounter problems and challenges which are not they are not familiar with, and when they operate within their own country. There's a lot of trial and error, a lot of learning involved. Not that there are no problems within China, that there are no implementation problems within China, but the problems actually multiply when China ventures into this country. where the political systems are different, with a very confusing array of actors and veto points. Now, let me give you a few examples. Let's start with Indonesia. So when they enter into Indonesia, they encountered decentralization and democratization, which occurred in post-1998 Indonesia. This has a huge impact on land acquisition in Indonesia. Land acquisition, of course, is the first step in the process of constructing the HSR. So as a result of delays in land acquisition, the project was actually delayed for several years. So let me explain a bit more. The center has weakened, okay, with decentralization, while the region seats have become a lot stronger. So in the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail negotiations, the agreement is actually between Beijing and Jakarta, with little consultation of local governments. So when Chinese companies go into Indonesia, they have to acquire land from local regencies. And in the process, because the local regencies are not involved in any of the negotiations, they encountered resistance, as the Chinese companies encountered resistance. Now, in total, 29 districts and 95 villages in West Java are actually directly impacted by the HSR construction. So you can imagine the huge task that Chinese companies have negotiating with so many of these districts and villages. So so Chinese companies have to face all these very powerful local authorities and very strong land tenure laws in Indonesia. Now, another factor that's had hindered implementation is bureaucratic resistance. You see this in Thailand. The State Railway of Thailand, for instance, is a major veto point and player in this whole process. The State Railway of Thailand actually makes money by selling land, but loses money on rail operations. So one of the key issues that in the negotiations and in the process of acquiring land is the compensation for the loss of land. There are also significant legal obstacles to the construction of the Thai China HSR. There are all these laws in Thailand that offer labor protection, procurement standards, land usage laws, environmental protection laws. So all these were, these are some of the legal barriers that are there, and which Prayut had to issue an executive order to overcome them when he wanted to push the project forward. Another issue is that when, for any infrastructure project to really succeed, having a champion is very important. Now, in Malaysia, for instance, former Prime Minister Najib was a stalwart champion of the East Coast railing and Kuala Lumpur, Singapore HSR. I mean, Cheng-Chwee will talk about this a bit more later on. However, when Najib lost power in May 2018 general elections, these projects actually lost a very powerful patron. And subsequently, when Mahathir Mohamad came in and took over and became prime minister, these projects were actually put on hold. They were scuttled. Subsequently, the projects came back online after Mahathir managed to renegotiate for better terms with the Chinese. Now, let me mention just one last obstacle, which is much more technical. Laos actually provides a really good example here. Now, constructing a HSR in Laos is actually a tremendous challenge because Laos is a very mountainous country. It's a huge engineering project that requires tunneling through all the mountains. In fact, there'll be a total of 170 bridges and 72 tunnels to be constructed. There are also all these large amounts of unexploded mines remaining from the Indo-China wars. So one very interesting remark from a Chinese railway engineer who was working on the project, this man actually said, and I quote, "We should have the United States demine the area." So in sum, what I actually want to put forward is that there are all these significant challenges that China experiences as it ventures into South Asia, be it in negotiations or implementation. Smaller states have all these agency that they can deploy when they negotiate, and they can stall all these projects as they are being constructed. Now, Cheng-Chwee will elaborate more on the diverse responses of South Asian states to China. He will also speak on the geoeconomic and geopolitical competition with the other major powers. Cheng-Chwee.
Thank you, Selina. Good evening or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Building upon what Mike and Selina have just presented, let me focus on the how and why issues of how and why different smaller countries in Southeast Asia have responded differently. And towards the end of my presentation, perhaps the final 2-3 minutes, I shall talk about very briefly about the geopolitical and also geo-economic implications of the wider China's Belt and Road related economic statecraft in the region. So first thing first, let's deal with the issue of how before we elaborate about the issue of why. So in chapter 4, we have these 2x2 matrix, as you can see from this final slide of our presentation. We have this 2x2 matrix to basically to illustrate how and also to explain why. So the 4 quadrants on the slide represent 4 different types of responses. So quadrant 1, it's about enthusiastic embrace, represented by the case of Laos. Quadrant 2, receptive, but with cyclical recalibration. Example is Malaysia. And quadrant 3 and 4 are respectively more selective, flexible engagement in the case of Thailand, and then finally limited involvement in, represented by the case of Vietnam. So we can just very briefly use some illustration to showcase why we describe Laos and Malaysia are more receptive, but with different patterns in the sense that in the case of Laos, it's more stable. In the case of Malaysia, there are some fluctuation of recalibration. So in the case of Laos, we know that once the political leadership has decided, and in fact, when the groundbreaking ceremony was held in December 2016, once that decision was made, basically the construction went on. And in fact, as we talk, even with the COVID-19, the whole project is still very much on schedule to be completed in late next year, December 2021. Whereby in the case of Malaysia, we describe it as receptive, but with recalibration. As very briefly mentioned by Selina earlier on, we knew that when Mahathir 2.0, Mahathir Mohamad came back to power after the historic election in May 2018, one of the first things that he did was to suspend East Coast Railing, ECRL, along with 2 other controversial projects. So meaning that overall Malaysia was still very receptive, but the democratic and also the bottom-up dynamics, also inter-elite dynamics, compel or push the government of the day to suspend and recalibrate the whole project. And we knew that after 8 months long renegotiation in April 2019, ECRL was resumed along with other projects. So let's compare and contrast these quadrant 1 and 2 with quadrant 3 and 4. So in the case of Thailand, we knew that Thailand has been engaging China on the Belt and Road related rail projects. The Sino-Thai project from Bangkok to Nong Khai is clearly a good example, although there are EEC projects as well. But let's focus on this Sino-Thai project. So Thailand, in a matter of few years, have held around nearly 30 rounds of negotiation. But by the time we have completed the book, we knew that only 3.5 kilometer of phase 1, I'm saying 3.5, not 35 kilometer, has been constructed. And then with the fate of the phase 2 from Korat to Nong Khai still uncertain. So meaning that Thailand engaged, but very selectively, flexibly, and also very gradually. It takes time, yeah. And this is, again, is a sharp contrast to quadrant 4, Vietnam's case. It's very limited in the sense that Vietnam has been very cautious in engaging China-related projects, and there is only one China-related project that is going on in Vietnam when it comes to rail, and that's the urban rail system in Hanoi, which has been delayed for quite some time, again and again. So now, what explains? So why we see all these different responses? And of course, although here we only talk about 4 different countries, we know that this typology can be applied to other ASEAN countries. And in fact, we would argue that the same typology can be extended and applied to the wider, smaller countries' responses to foreign power-backed infrastructure projects. So what explained that? Why is that so? Selina early on mentioned about a number of domestic factors, such as state capacity, such as public opinion, and also location, level of development, so on and so forth. So those are clearly very important, but you also bear in mind other domestic factors, such as inter-elite competition, patronage politics, and also some bottom-up sentiments. So we have grouped all these domestic factors into two clusters of variables. As you could see from the slide, we have reflect these two variables along different axes of this spectrum, of these metrics. So the first variable is about legitimation. And elite legitimation clearly is a big, big factor that explains why different countries have responded differently. So we would focus on, we thought that states try to legitimize and enhance their domestic authority through different pathways. The most important pathway is what we call as development pathway. So economic development would determine the performance and hence their authority to rule at home. This is clearly one very important pathway, but our research also indicates that it's not just about development or performance legitimation. It's also about identity-based legitimation, in the sense that some sentiment and also identity-based, such as anti-China nationalism, such as Thai autonomy, clearly is an important pathway as well. In some cases, like in the case of Thailand and Vietnam, it does offset the importance of development-based legitimation. So this is why we have seen different reactions. For Malaysia and for Laos, and you can say for Cambodia and other countries, development-based is the most important legitimation, and hence they are more receptive about China-backed real projects represented by quadrant 1 and 2. But in comparison, Thailand and Vietnam, even though development-based legitimation is very, very important, but this is somehow offset and mitigated by other ideational and identity-based legitimation. As I mentioned briefly, anti-China sentiment clearly constrained and limited the Vietnamese elites to go too closely with China Belt and Road Initiative. And the same case for Thailand, despite the fact that development is important, but precisely because of the military regime has to rely on China for the overall rule, they try to keep some distance by not going too fast and not too closely when it comes to a Sino-Thai project. It's very important for them to ensure about the autonomy. During our fieldwork, many Thai elites share with us, they keep emphasizing, this is Thailand. We need to do things in Thai ways. So that should clearly show some internal dynamics, which brings me to the second variable, which is we regard it as an intervening variable of power pluralization. And this is a variable that Mike has elaborated during his earlier part of research, but he applied earlier on to the case of China. Here we are applying it to Southeast Asia, and we notice that this is clearly a very important intervening factor that shape or reshape the importance of legitimation in determining smaller state reactions. So because of power is being decentralized across different competing elites and also state-society relations, so we see political system does play a role in explaining why in the case of Malaysia, it is more fluctuated compared to Laos, and why in this case Thailand is also more hesitant and also more limited when it compares to Vietnam. In the case of Vietnam and Laos, because of power is more centralized on the ruling elites, once decision is made, whether receptive or not receptive, that decision is very much carry on as in due course. Which brings me to my final point about, very briefly, about the geopolitical and also geoeconomic dimensions of the whole dynamic. So when we were doing researching and also writing, there was only about like the one alternative mechanism compared to China-backed railroad, Belt and Road projects in Southeast Asia. Yeah. So geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics are important because of it provides from the smaller states' point of view, it provides an alternative issue. But during early years, Japan clearly was the only alternative that is perceived by smaller countries as reliable and also a good alternative to China-backed Belt and Road projects. And we do see that in due course, Japan has not only pushed forward their own partnership for quality infrastructure, but they have also in a way partnered with or influenced other members of a quadrilateral security initiative, US, Australia, and also India, to also come up with their own mechanism. So by now, by I would say 2018, we have already seen the emergence of a multiple alternative mechanism, such as EU actually passed the EU-ASEAN connectivity, EU-Asia connectivity scheme. The same year, US also passed the Build Act. And at the same time, we have heard also a lot about the Quad-related mechanism, such as the Blue Dot Network, such as the Economic Prosperity Network. So all these competing schemes, to some extent, provide alternative scheme to smaller countries in Southeast Asia. How things will evolve and whether or not to what extent, at what pace, these will emerge and constitute what Mike emphasized in the concluding chapter about the balanced connectivity. I think this is one of the key issues to observe and to see in the coming years, if not coming decades. And I would stop here. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you all. We're now open for questions and comments, and we've had 3 or 4 that have come in. Si Young from the Voice of America asked the question, people are saying that when elephants fight, the ants get trampled. But in October, you see the Secretary of State Pompeo and Chinese Prime Minister Wang Yi were in Southeast Asia wooing the countries in the region. His question is, are small states and medium powers in the region really powerless in the face of the 2 opposing elephants? It wasn't directed to a specific person, though it was said this question was first out of the chute when Mike Lampton was talking.
Well, I'd like my colleagues to weigh in on this, but I think this gets to the point when there's multiple interest, whether it's strategically derives from strategic considerations, military or economic. When big powers compete, the smaller nations have the capacity to find out what the highest bidder for whatever priority they may have is. So I think it gives considerable latitude. Just for example, I'll give 2 examples. Cambodia, when we were there, I think it's fair to say that at least in the Western perception, Cambodia is pretty much aligned, at least in the last extremity, with China. And that if China doesn't like an emerging consensus in ASEAN, then they put the pressure on Cambodia, and Cambodia doesn't necessarily go along with the consensus. And so Beijing's priorities are reflected in that result. Cambodians that we talk to have a much more complicated universe. First of all, they almost uniformly said they would like to cooperate more with the US. Now, of course, given the human rights problems and the domestic politics in the US, that's not so easy. But certainly in Vietnam, we're cooperating in a much greater degree, but still the political considerations and human rights considerations at least influence the relationship. All of these countries would, I think, like to cooperate more with the US if we were willing, both on human rights terms and in terms of financial commitment. So I think the basic rule is that these are countries that have their priorities and are looking to build relations with those that can best help them achieve their priorities.
John, maybe I can add to
Sure.
that. I think in my presentation just now, I talked about the bargaining power that smaller states have. But I think in addition to what I said, there are a couple of things that that are at the advantage of the smaller states, in the sense that there is such a thing as great power restraint. I mean, hegemons, great powers cannot do as they please. They have to restrain themselves. They cannot come across as bullies. They have to, as one of our colleagues have ever said in one of her written products, if for a leader, you need followers. There's no point in leading when you have no followers, right? So great powers actually need to do two things. They have to mind their reputational cost. They cannot appear to be bullies. So in that sense, there's maneuvering space for smaller states. The other thing is that they need to provide public goods. And in a way, I mean, China portrays the BRI as a public good. So the issue here is, the United States have always been providing public good in a liberal international order, right? The question is, these public goods, are they meeting the needs of countries in the region? They have to be, I mean, the fact that Pompeo have to go to the ground and listen to what states need, what smaller states need, I mean, they will have to fine tune the kind of public goods that are being provided. So public goods provision, reputational costs, all these things are the roles that great powers need to play. So for smaller countries, what you need to do, and which I actually explained in my presentation, is that you really need to be nimble. You must know, where your strengths lie and how you can bargain to your advantage, and use those tools, which, the three conditions that I have just now, the tools that you have to negotiate. So you have to be astute, you have to be nimble. Smaller states definitely have agency. You just have to know where to put yourself to exercise the agency.
Cheng-Chwee, do you have a quick comment? No, please unmute. Unmute.
My quick answer to this good question is really, this is all about hedging. For smaller states in Southeast Asia, and I would say elsewhere, big power competition, big power dynamics are nothing new. It's a recurring theme. And instinctively, as a human being, leaders, regardless of the political colors, naturally would try to hedge. And we are hedging not just in terms of all this infrastructure development, I would say in many other aspects on South China Sea, so on and so forth. So let's just take some examples. And those would clearly illustrate that hedging is a natural tendency, but to what extent, in what way this hedging tendency vis-a-vis the competing powers will be materialized. Sometimes it's not just up to smaller countries. It's also depending on whether or not there is any alternative and credible alternative. Just one quick example, and this is something that John, you're very familiar with in the case of Thailand. We know that Thailand, I would say, is a master of hedging all this while. And when it comes to infrastructure development, Thailand has making sure that power dynamics, power balancing will always in the backdrop. So we see Thailand when dealing with China on the Bangkok-Nong Khai rail. At the same time, they also make sure that Japan is very much in the picture. So they have been talking about with Japan about the East-West line, but also about the Bangkok-Chiang Mai line. But it's just that up to some point after a feasibility study, Japan has decided on economic reasons not to go ahead with the Bangkok-Chiang Mai rail. So that kind of decision, I would say that reduce, if not eliminate the smaller countries hedging space, but whether or not other alternative schemes that we mentioned earlier on would come into picture, I think that would depend on how things will evolve.
Yeah, thank you. Our next, we're probably not going to have enough time to get through, but we will run over a little bit. Michael Goodman from the University of Wisconsin at Madison asked, does the low level of Vietnamese involvement in the project have anything to do with the traditional enmity between Vietnam and China?
In a word, yes. But I think there's a little bit of a tendency in Western analysis to attach more importance to the what you might call conflictual history than the cooperative. And I think over the hundreds of years of history, there's been both cooperation and more or less cooperation between Vietnam and China. So I think you have to keep two ideas in mind. But yes, I think the level of anxiety that the Vietnamese have about China, not just military, that definition of strategic worry, though it's there, but also what you might call cultural autonomy, also the mere sheer scale and force of China's economy, the movement of Chinese people, entrepreneurial, the history of overseas Chinese in Vietnam itself. There's what you might call cultural autonomy, societal and economic self-preservation set of worries. So I would say it's not just a simple sort of reduction of past conflict and projection to the future, although the wasn't so long ago in 1979, there was literal conflict, but I think it's just very deeply ingrained in terms of cultural identity, economic fears, and then there's practical experience. It was mentioned, I think Selina mentioned the Hanoi light rail system. That has not been a successful project for China. The firm that initiated it from China had no prior experience on an international project. And part of the picture we paint about China is that, yes, there's the big Xi Jinping BRI vision written into the Constitution, but also there's the bottom of the Chinese system, provinces, municipalities, corporations, SOEs. And they're all extremely entrepreneurial and they're pushing their pet projects. And this can be a very rapacious kind of push that these countries face. And they sometimes have to wonder who's actually speaking for China. So I would say it's much more complicated than just the historical storyline would suggest. But nonetheless, the resistance is very real.
Thank you. In the interest of time, why don't we go to the next question? This is from my colleague in Bangkok, Benjamin Zawacki. It says, kindly address the extent to which China is constructing these iron rivers in response to its Malacca dilemma, particularly from a security rather than an economic standpoint. Rails are inherently dual use, meaning that China's motivation could be as much about potential conflict as about peaceful connectivity. Did this come up in interviews? Do you yourself subscribe to this view? So that's his question. I don't know who would like to take that.
Yeah, Cheng-Chwee, do you want to take a whack at it?
I think the short answer to this would be clearly geostrategic consideration on the part of China is one of the many reasons or drivers on any of the projects. And it is more important perhaps in some projects than the others. For example, East Coast Rail Link, the one that connect basically the port and also the cities along the east coast of Malaysia on the part of South China Sea with the one in the Strait of Malacca. Clearly, I think this is very much driven by the geostrategic consideration of helping or allowing China to mitigate the energy insecurity on the part of China. But the host government will have a different kind of domestic dynamics, to what extent they're collaborating with that. But we shouldn't, I think, emphasize the geostrategic elements too much, because clearly there are domestic development logics that convince, and I would say that on the part of smaller countries, this is domestic development is a more important driver in convincing them to what extent and whether or not they should go ahead and collaborate with China. I think perhaps Selina can elaborate along this line.
Selina, you want to go ahead?
I think perhaps in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the next questions, John. I think
okay. All right. Anne-Marie Murphy from Seton Hall University has a question. How does China perceive Southeast Asian governments' attempts to resist unwelcome practices such as the use of Chinese labor, negotiative attractive financing, or limit certain projects? Does China perceive resistance solely as a function of the projects or also as pushback against what Chinese efforts exert political and economic influence in the region?
Maybe I just frame an answer and then my colleagues could fill in or disagree. China, not long ago, had what was called the Second Belton Road Forum. And what was notable is the degree to which China recognized some of the complaints that, not just in Southeast Asia, but in BRI projects on a global basis, and recognized that China had made mistakes or had pursued friction-inducing policies by bringing in excessive labor, not sufficient attention to environment, problems with displaced people along right-of-ways or land that had to be expropriated for dams or power grids and so forth. So I would say that just looking at recent China interaction with, let us say, the partners on BRI projects, they've evinced at least they understand there have been some problems, and I identified some. So I think that speaks to the whole issue of where they see the problems. Selina, what do you have to say?
So maybe I'll just add on to what Mike said, which is to give an example of what's happening in Cambodia. So, you know, in Cambodia, we always think of the government as extremely being very close to China, right? And, you know, the Cambodian government doesn't actually criticize the Chinese on a lot of things, despite the fact that on the ground, in public opinion, in civil society, among academics, people that we met in Cambodia, there are a lot of criticisms about Chinese presence in Cambodia. And they always invariably always refer to Sihanouk Field, which is full of Chinese businesses, particularly in terms of like casinos. So there are always these huge complaints about gang fights, crime, and being overrun by the Chinese in Sihanouk Field. So that was one of the key things. But and one of the criticisms that we hear when we were on the ground in Cambodia is that, you know, the Chinese embassy is not paying attention to all these negative feedback and not doing anything. But that is not entirely true, because subsequently, and in this year, it's just been reported that the Chinese have actually closed some of these casinos and tried to rein in some of these illegal activities that are going on in certain parts of their country. So in Cambodia, sorry. And so in a sense, China does respond. It does react to all these criticisms, although a bit slowly, perhaps because information gets a long time to be floated up to them, or the embassy doesn't react as quickly as some of us would like, but they do try and listen.
Yeah, I might just, I think there's another important dimension, and that is on this whole BRI in the first case and high-speed rail and activity in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of controversy in China. Some of the strongest criticism of Chinese behavior was leveled in China by Chinese in our interviews. The questions run the problems that some Chinese people have, particularly intellectuals and people in universities, and some of China's most famous universities wonder, why is China spending so much money? What's the quality of the financial risk analysis? Why are we building in places sometimes that are highly insecure, requiring security commitments like Pakistan? So it wouldn't be simply, it would be easy if only the external elements were criticizing China. But the fact is it's hard to say how powerful they are, but there is, I think, a sort of wide body of opinion in China that maybe they're undertaking too much, too fast, with too great an expenditure. And certainly China's slowing economy plus COVID, I would think, would energize those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of groups even more.
We're at 10 o'clock, and we have more questions than we really have time for, but I'm going to take the next three questions, and let's just extend to 10:10 if that's all right with all of you. My colleague Anthea Mulakala in Malaysia says, in your interview with Chinese companies, what steps are they taking to deal with local implementation challenges? For example, dealing with communities, local government diversity, and land disputes.
Well, Mike, I will just answer this question. Maybe Cheng-Chwee can talk about what's happening with some of the issues in Malaysia or something. So I think that one of the things that became very clear to us as we do field work all over Southeast Asia is that Chinese companies, workers live in their own enclave. And in some places in Vietnam, for instance, they are known as Chinese colonies. Basically, they do not interact very much with local people. They cook their own food and they live within their own compounds and communities. So, and there's always a language barrier. So I would say that actually Chinese companies do not do very much in dealing with some of these local community issues. What happens is that these issues are actually being dealt with at the government to government level. So if there are any problems with, land disputes or land negotiations, land acquisition problems, they leave it to the government, to the higher ups to deal with these issues. And so that's why you have things like, the Indonesian government or the Thai government needing to have all these orders. In Indonesia, you have the presidential regulations to push forward all these projects in Jakarta. And also in Thailand, you have Prayu coming out with this executive order to push forward all these projects. So a lot of these issues are being dealt with at the government level and not quite so much at the local company level. Am I right, Cheng-Chwee?
Sure, very quickly, and that reminds me of actually one of the few works that we did a few years ago when ECRL, East Coast Railing, was still suspended. So 3 of us, we traveled to the northeast part of Malaysian Peninsula. We went to actually Station 1 in the part of Kelantan, which is Malaysia-Thai border. So we spent some time there. Of course, they did allow us to go in. But from the side, we did see their attempts. So I think Chinese firms and in fact, perhaps Chinese actors across the board are still very much on the learning curve, but they did make attempts to, I think, communicate with, also engage the local. Like for example, during the site, we saw that they make it a point to show all the local languages. It's not just about Chinese. So you see a Malay, you see some Jawi, so on and so forth. On important sides of it. So that I think is an indicator of they are trying to make attempts. And I should say that on this issue, in fact, the burdens shouldn't be just about on the part of China. In fact, local government, and that's part of the agency of host country that we talk about, should also push, and also it is our land, it's our territory. So we need to make it a point to also communicate to a Chinese part that how to do things. So again, on ECRL, after the renegotiation in April 2019, we do see CCCC, the Chinese contractor of ECRL project, make a lot of adjustment and concession with the Chinese side in increasing and also ensuring the local contents, either in terms of local employment, about the the usage of local resources, and also the terms of development. Yeah, so the transit-oriented development project and so on and so forth. So we do see China is also trying to make attempts, sometimes on their own initiative, sometimes in reaction to the host government's push.
Right. I think the this is a fascinating question on how are firms adjusting, and just speaking personally, I wish we had had more time and access to Chinese firms at the very local level operating to get a clearer picture. But as Cheng-Chwee mentioned, we did go to the East Coast Rail Link construction site. They let us into the management house. We talked to the PR people, as I recall. That was about the end, but it was very revealing, because all over the walls were what I would call attempts to build Chinese multinational corporate culture, down to what you might call taglines, advertising lines. One I remember was to the effect, "We bring good things to people all over the world," right? And it was just row after row of these attempts to build a kind of global consciousness into firms that, until at most a decade before, had always operated in the airlock of China. So China has a huge problem. These companies that were sort of in a hothouse of planned economy are suddenly going to a diversity of countries, competing with the Japanese, the French, and the Germans. And so they have to kind of build their own corporate cultures, and that will take a time if they're successful. But I think if we're counting on the Chinese just stumbling before they get to the finish line, I don't think that's probably the right strategy here.
But I actually think that these, the East Coast reeling thing that we saw is actually within the compound of the construction side. The signboards, the propaganda images, the slogans that they use, are actually all internal, which means that outside of the compound, people can't really walk in. It's only guests that are allowed into this compound. So I want to make the point, well, this is true, that some of the companies are doing all these little things to try and communicate with the local communities. They are very much within their own enclaves on the ground, and they live separately, language-wise. Maybe some people learn, but maybe not others. I would think that actually most of the problems are being resolved at the government-to-government level, the key issues. Although local companies can do some of these parts, but some of these things, they are within their own enclave.
Yeah. We're getting short on time, but our next question is from Stephen Zhu. He asks, is it possible to distinguish China's involvement for profits and those for influence, or does such distinction exist at all in Southeast Asia?
I can actually quickly answer this because the Global Times itself, I have to look for the citation of this particular article, but the Global Times itself actually quite a while back distinguished between projects that are for commercial value, for profitability, and those that are strategic in nature. So they do distinguish. And I think the thing about our high-speed railway, the high-speed railway that we studied in this book, is that they are considered strategic projects in the sense that profitability takes a backseat, right? We know all the risks that comes with huge mega projects like this, where, in the case of, for example, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, people think that they're not going to see any profits, until maybe like 40 years later. So it takes decades for any of these railway lines to make profits. So in this case, it's strategic more than a commercial value. But there are, of course, all those other projects that focus on commerce.
Well, I think there's a big vision. If you ask what Xi Jinping, BRI, and so on, what's the underlying vision? It is to make China the hub for the flow of economic, human, and other power resources, including military. And China's willing to have a long time horizon on this and consider many possible payoffs beyond profit. So I think that it's this vision that's driving it. And you have policy banks that fund the vision, even if the payback period is very long. And then you have more commercially oriented lenders that have a tighter time horizon, better risk analysis, and so forth. But I think the Chinese have a comprehensive vision of both economic power, profitability, and projection of both cultural power, soft power, and military power. And so that they're not driven by quarterly, yearly, or even 5-year plans in the sense of how they assess whether a project serves their interests. So I think they have a very broad matrix, but that basically it serves all of these interests, economic, strategic, and cultural.
Our last question is going to come from my colleague, Ji-Hung Bo, who is currently a research fellow at Australian National University, but when not that, she's our China country representative. She says, in your research and as part of the book, do you talk about the comparison between the China model and the Washington consensus, in the sense that, is there a great sense of acceptance on the side of Southeast Asian countries of China's way of development, the emphasis on build the road and you will get rich? Are Southeast Asian countries expressing a sense of impatience with Western donors who emphasize more on governance? And the idea of the environment and social standards, high standards required by Western donors and multilateral banks, mean that the projects take years to plan.
let me just say hello to Hong Guo. Nice to hear you indirectly. I think an important part of the book, and the answer to your question is yes, we don't talk much about the Washington consensus versus Beijing consensus, but we do talk about the role of industrial policy. And one of the things we have to say about it is that in many cases the US forgets the role that industrial policy has made in some of the biggest transformations, technological and economics, that the US ever had. Transcontinental Railroad, we gave away 9% of the surface area of the United States to the railroads. That was a pretty big subsidy. Eisenhower highway system, NASA in space, the internet. So the first thing we point out is the US, in some of its most successful transformational ventures, has itself had industrial policy. We secondly point out that, and there's a long section in the book about how China built its high-speed rail industry. And it's really a remarkable story that begins in about the year 2000 with no significant, it was a big railroad ministry and in industry in that sense, but not technologically competitive and not very much very welcome in many respects by the Chinese people that had to ride those trains. So anyway, in 2000, China had a very entrepreneurial minister of railroads and had a far-seeing plan built out in the next decade, the industry, the domestic rail system. So by the time, in a sense, Xi Jinping came in and inherited all the previous development work of the preceding 15 years. And so China had an industrial policy, and so along comes Trump, and he wants China to move away from industrial policy. Well, I wouldn't presume to speak for the Chinese, but my basic understanding would be they see many elements of industrial policy, civil nuclear power, high-speed rails, power development, as to have been very successful. So I guess the way we approach it is, yes, China has industrial policy. We're not advocating that the US have anything like Chinese industrial policy, but we do point out that we have been successful upon occasion when we did, and maybe we need a little more of it. So it isn't the kind of usual Beijing consensus, Washington consensus. I think we, maybe to this view of some, muddy the waters, but we do talk a lot about it.
Selina, Cheng-Chwee, did you have any final remarks?
Sure, very quick. Selina?
No, Cheng-Chwee, go ahead, it's okay.
Sure, as a Southeast Asian and an observer of smaller state behavior, I always feel that the very issue or debate of China model versus Western model, or Beijing consensus versus Washington consensus, as an interesting but kind of misleading one. There clearly are a number of blind spots about this issue, because if you are putting yourself in smaller countries' shoes, actually we do not have to choose between these two supposedly contending models. In fact, in reality, and that's confirmed during our fieldwork, smaller countries kind of pick and choose depending on what is convenient and what is available, what is necessary. So it's not a matter of we adopt or follow China model in one way or another, but we are leveraging aspects that we need. Like, for example, ruling elites in Southeast Asia will try to leverage the availability of Chinese capital and technology that will help them to perform and deliver performance legitimacy. It's not a matter of we want to be a follower in one way or another.
So I just quickly add, hi Hong Guo, how are you? Long time no see. I just wanted to actually type the answer to her. I have actually a forthcoming article in International Affairs that actually addresses this discursive aspect of Chinese forays into Southeast Asia, how they sell the model and what is the response and reaction from the ground. So the point that I want to make is that there is quite a bit of resonance. In fact, countries like Cambodia and Laos have actually signed on to the idea of community of shared destiny. That shows a lot of agreement with the Chinese model. And but ASEAN as a whole has actually resisted the idea of community of shared destiny. And Indonesia definitely did not sign on to the idea. But so the point is, while they want, as Cheng-Chwee said, they want to do the things, adapt the model that is suitable for themselves, primarily economically, they are actually very conscious of one aspect, is the resistance to the idea that Chinese culture is preeminent. So for a country like Indonesia, the idea that Chinese culture is preeminent, no, I mean, considering their issues with their own Chinese population. So Hong Kong, I was asking you in my answer to you that if you could send me your email, you can email me, I can send you a copy of it. So this article actually builds on the Rivers of Iron. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think the sign of any successful panel discussion or webinar is that when you have more answers than, more questions than time allows. And that's the case. And for the 2 or 3 individuals that had questions that we weren't able to answer, my apologies. But as you can tell from the discussion over the last hour and 15 minutes, there's a lot in this book. You know, Mike talking about the similarities just sort of like between the Transcontinental Railroad and trying to build railways in Southeast Asia, and the lack of uniformity and the contending interests you know, involved and taking place in 2 different parts of the world in 2 very different time periods. It just shows that there's maybe some more commonality than differences. And so with that, I want to recommend, this is my only prop for the night, but if you should buy this book, Rivers of Iron, and by Mike Lampton, Selina Ho, and Kuik Cheng-Chwee. And Mike and Selina and Cheng-Chwee, thank you very much for speaking tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good night or a good day wherever you are. So thank you again. Good evening.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome. Bye-bye. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Good night and
Good
good
night.
morning.
Good night. Yes.